You've moved forward into an entirely new world. It's powered by Gen AI. Can you talk about what that's enabling you to do?
Yeah, it is freaking astonishing. If you had told me a year ago that we would be able to do what we do now, I wouldn't have believed you.
Welcome to the SaaS Builder Podcast. I'm your host, Randy Wooten, and today we're going to discuss SaaS Gen AI-powered pricing technologies. What a mouthful. Joining me is Stephen Forth, who's a co-founder and CEO at Ibakka, which helps B2B SaaS companies communicate value, price smarter, and grow faster through their strategic pricing advisory services and pricing and customer value management software platform. Stephen is a speaker recognized by OpenView Partners as one of the top 10 B2B SaaS pricing experts. And actually, we used Stephen in his company at Maxio when I got here and had a great experience. That's not why I have him on the show, but as an endorsement, Stephen, it's great to have you on the podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about, can Gen AI optimize your SaaS pricing?
Which is an important topic that I think a lot of people are exploring right now.
It is, and you guys are out leading the way. I love all the content you're producing, and it's hard. And what you've been thinking about and the way you've been framing it, I think you are really helping us to define the debate. So let's dive in. We have a couple of topics we want to get into. First, can you just help us? We're out in front trying to figure it all out, but a lot of people are like, AI, I'm scared about it. I'm not sure what to do with it. Can you give us an overview of the pre-gen AI SaaS pricing landscape for early stage businesses, like the strategies and the tactics for how they would think about pricing before we layer in the intelligence layer on top?
Now, so we could start with the good, the bad, and the ugly. And maybe let's start actually with the ugly. I think most, and it's not just early stage, I think most SaaS companies have two modes of pricing. One is let's throw it at the wall and see what sticks. And the second is frozen accidents. Somebody priced it this way sometime. We forget how and why, but we're too scared to change it. Those I'm afraid are the two most, even today, those are the two most common approaches to pricing we see.
What about,
When
I hear you on that. I think of two other ones just having been in this chair for a bit. One is you go out and you look at the competition. And you're like,
Yeah,
if they're doing it, I'll do it. But they don't understand the value and how to differentiate because you just don't want to end up in like a pricing battle. The other
yeah.
one, which I found, is if you work for a PE company, is they've got lots of smart people who think pricing is one of the most important levers and tell you this is how you need to do it. So how do you think about those for companies that are just getting started, may not have VC backed? Is the competitive comparison a great way to go, or what would you think?
In most cases, no. And there's a couple of reasons for that. You're probably comparing yourself against someone who's a lot more established than you are. So you are saying, I'm going to play on their battleground, which is not how you win if you're a young company. You don't win by thinking you can play a big company's game better than they play it, because you can't. And I often hear, I do angel investing too. And I often hear companies that I'm investing in say, we're going to do it cheaper. And there's a couple of problems with that. First one is they assume that the big company has its prices at the level they're at because they can't go cheaper. But actually, the big companies have economies of scale that you don't have as a small company. And should you become a threat, they can crush you. And the second is pricing relative to a competitor means you're not establishing or communicating your own value. I think both of those are, I think the competitive pricing is something you have to be very careful with. Of course, you have to know how your competitors are pricing because value is always relative to the competition. If you look at how you do value-based pricing, part of it is you have to know what the next best competitive alternative is, and that defines the market's part of the pricing. The value that you create that is largely similar to the competitors, that's your commoditized value, and the price of that value is set by the market. But if all you have is commoditized value, why are you in business?
I think that's interesting. I remember it may have been you telling me this, or I read some article about there are really only two pricing strategies. You either go low cost or high value. And the low cost, like the Walmarts of the world, if you're going to compete, especially in SaaS, it gets a little funky because storage is effectively free, but you got to cover all the costs of the development. So how does that work and how do you play? But to your point, if you're going to go compete with a big SaaS company, they can discount to zero and they can go a long way because they got a bunch of customers that are already paying them money. And the value of the company is tied in that ongoing ARR, and they can just snuff you out. I think that's
Yeah.
what we're seeing with a lot of small companies right now that are going. So the thing in our pre-brief that you said, what I thought was really interesting, was the other way to think about it is if you think about the value thermometer and how much value are you creating and what's your fair share? How much are you capturing? And I think you said something like most SaaS companies historically have only captured 5% of the value that they're creating. Could you say a little bit more on that and that math? Because I'm like, oh my gosh, then everyone should be charging more. Why aren't they charging more to capture more of the value?
What one should base one's pricing on is what's called your differentiated value. So the value that you create that is greater than the next best competitive alternative. So, you're creating value, and then the question becomes, let's just assume for the moment that you know how much value you're creating, you can communicate that, and you can document it. Now, that's not true of 90% of companies, but let's just assume for a moment it's true. Then the question becomes, how much of that value can I fairly capture? And there's a number of things that determine that. One is just because you're creating value doesn't mean you can capture it. The stronger your brand, the more value you can capture. Let's face it, most early stage SaaS companies do not have strong brands. So they have relatively little pricing power. The second question is, what's your strategy? Because there are different pricing strategies. Are you trying to have a premium pricing strategy and capture as much value as possible? Or are you trying to run a penetration strategy and capture as little value as you can afford to and build your market? So either of those are credible strategies. You just have to be really clear on what you're trying to do.
I think one of the things that you identified, just the assumption that people know what the value is that they are creating, is a huge assumption. So maybe we can shift now to, I think this is what, when we've been chatting, is so exciting about Gen AI applied to this part of the market is how did people think about identifying the value that they were delivering pre Gen AI?
Yeah, this is where the PE firms and the consultants and come in, and there are some very large consulting firms that do this, and then there are some scrappier, dare I say, smarter pricing firms that do this. There's a guy called Marcus Rivera who competes with Ibaka. He calls it street pricing. Great guy, great approach. But we go in, and this is what Ibaka used to do this too. We would go in and we would build a value model for you. And then we would validate that value model, and then we would run it against your data and really understand how and where you were creating value. Problem with this approach is twofold. One is it takes smart people and it takes time. And the time plus the smart people means it costs a lot of money. And the other problem with time is that by the time it's done, the market has changed.
Yeah.
So that's the traditional approach. And I've been doing that sort of thing for the last almost 20 years.
I think just to interrupt, this is what we contracted with you guys to do. When I came on board, the PE firm, Chelsea Stoner, my general partner, said startups, SaaS companies totally undervalue monetization, i.e., pricing as a lever to pull. They're either focused on new logo sales or gross retention in terms of churn prevention, but they don't focus on monetization. And that's the number one thing they focused on. And I think it was for the first year, I was like, yeah. And then we hired you guys to do basically what you described. You came in and built a value model. You went out and you interviewed a bunch of customers and prospects for us, came back. It took a couple of months, and then we revised our pricing. But now you have moved forward, and that was only a couple of years ago. Now you've moved forward into an entirely new world that's powered by Gen AI. Can you talk about what that's enabling you to do?
Yeah, it is freaking astonishing. I mean, and um, if you had told me a year ago that we would be able to do what we do now, I wouldn't have believed you. And I think if you still went and talked to a lot of the experts in the field, they would say this is something that Gen AI cannot do. And frankly, a year ago, I thought that too. But we have had enormous success over the last 6 months in using generative AI to build value models, not in months, not in weeks, not in days, but in hours. And I think we can actually get that down to less than an hour and probably less than half an hour in the near future. It still takes some human interaction, but the human interaction is now guided. And the Gen AI is like a force multiplier. It truly is astonishing, Randy. I can't say how gobsmacked I am about this.
And
I
you've been
tried it
doing pricing for how long?
20 years.
So 20 years, expert, bought by the top companies in the world to come in and do this sort of analysis. And in 1 year, your entire paradigm has shifted in terms of how to embrace AI and to use it as augmented intelligence. The business model that you're going to be in, the offerings you provide are going to be radically different.
They're going to be completely different. And just before we go there, I just want to note that we can now do things that were very hard and expensive to do. When you have a value model, right? You have a value model, a cost model, a pricing model, and you want to understand how they interact at different levels of scale. That used to require a lot of coding to answer those questions, a lot of custom coding. We can now get good insights to that in minutes. This is fundamentally game changing. Another tough problem is what parts of your functionality are driving value. Figuring that out and mapping that used to give me a brain cramp. But you need to know that, right? You need to know that for three reasons. One is you should know when you are configuring a solution for your customer how to configure the solution that will give them the most value. And I'm going to suggest that with Gen AI and Gen AI driven configuration systems, we're going to get much more flexible as to how we configure solutions.
But I think one of the things that you're not saying and fully recognizing is it's the 20 years of experience that you've had that over the last year, you're using this Gen AI as augmented intelligence, but you've had to train it. You had to teach it
Yes.
through the prompts.
Yeah.
Not someone off the street couldn't come build a value model with Gen AI. It's because of all that mastery that you have that's allowing you to do this now. So it's taking it to another level. Maybe talk a little bit about that because I do think people think about AI and the downsides of AI and the risks of AI around hallucination, et cetera. Do you really want to trust your pricing to an AI where it's a black box and you don't know how it got to the answer? You can't go back and trace literally the model, the assumptions, and the core inputs. So, how have you guys put parameters on AI without giving away your secret sauce, obviously? But how are you working with the LLMs to tune them for this specific problem set?
Yeah. So I want to answer the question about traceability first, and then I'll get. I actually think that the current generation of LLMs have far better traceability and give you far better insight into how they're reasoning than what we had a year ago. So if you look at O1, OpenAI's O1 reasoning model, it actually does a pretty good job of explaining how it's reasoning. And you can force most language models, if you use chain of thought and some other prompting techniques, to be pretty explicit about the rationale. So they are actually much more transparent and easier to understand than what the dynamic pricing systems do, which really are black boxes. So I actually think Gen AI is more transparent than any form of AI we've had before it.
You're talking more like machine learning, logistic regression analysis type stuff. Was that what
So
people were using previously as first gen AI, or what were you talking? Because we
yes,
talked about this
so
before, the old
yeah,
guard using dynamic pricing. Help me
yeah.
understand that.
So have you seen that television commercial where there's a chicken sitting at a keyboard, pecking at the keyboard, and it says that's what's setting the price for your airplane ticket?
Yeah,
So that chicken is the old dynamic pricing engines.
right.
And there's some great companies in this area: Pros, Vendavo, Zilliant, PriceFX. Stefan Lioza, who I think you know, is now the
Yeah.
chief value officer. Stefan's now the chief value officer at Zilliant.
Oh, is he really? Oh, that's great. Brilliant
Yeah,
guy. Brilliant guy.
yeah.
Yeah.
What those things are trying to do is look at irregularities in your data and estimate willingness to pay from that.
Uh huh.
So you're say you're a sales guy and you've got a fancy dynamic pricing engine that says Randy, Maxio should be willing to pay X dollars to Ibakka for some services we're about to render. And I say, Randy, you should pay us X. And you go, why? And I said, my fancy AI said you should be willing to pay that. He said, I don't care what your AI thinks.
Right.
It's like, who cares? But anyway, so that's the previous generation of dynamic pricing. And I think we're moving into a completely different world in which we can now use the AIs to estimate value and get insights into how to price. And that's what I'm really excited about. You're right. It does require a lot of textual information. So it's set up as a RAG, the retrieval augmented generation. You need to be working with, and Ibaka aren't the only people that are doing this. So you need to be working with someone who can set up a generative AI so that it has the right context, so it has the right structure of prompts, so that quality control methods are in place. You can even set up, again, a generative adversarial network to test the quality and make sure the quality is continually improving. There's a lot of expertise and IP involved, but A SaaS company with, say, 2 million in ARR probably could not afford to engage with someone like Ibaka, and they certainly couldn't afford to engage with one of the big companies.
But do you think they
This,
could have the expertise to do this with Gen AI? Because what we're all anxious about is that the AI is going to give bad guidance. That when we were chatting, you talked about it regressing to the middle, and then what I worry about, especially with pricing, it has hallucinations. But we're 240 people. I don't have anybody who has this background and experience who I could put on as a pricing expert. Maybe what you're saying is you need to find someone like a legacy accountant to come in who's cutting edge pricing guy or gal and have them do this for you. But I don't think just you can pick it up and do it on your own. Do you? Or
you need a lot of guidance. You need someone to hold your hand and someone
yep.
who has all the extra contextual information, knows how to structure the prompts, knows how to put the safeguards in place. So those things are all true. But if you can do this sort of thing in a couple of hours, then the cost of doing it goes way down.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So you're going to build a different value delivery, which may be you can support 15 in parallel at a lower price point, and then it allows you to get into our segment where the earlier stage SaaS solution can take advantage of it, but it's a different package.
Yeah. And from Ibaka's point of view, because Ibaka prices per model, that's how our pricing model works. That's not going to work next year because in a world where if you're a big company, you had maybe 15, 20 models max, someone like Maxia would probably have 2 or 3 models. Okay, you can price by model. In a world where you can generate new value models and pricing models on an as needed basis, you need a radically different approach to pricing too. So Ibaka has disrupted its own pricing.
Right. And that's advertising from Axio. That's where we're trying to figure out is how do we support people like you that are doing business transformation and coming out with usage-based models or value-based models and track it. Let's do this just to wrap up this section. Can you give us a better understanding for the prerequisites that you would recommend for early stage founders before they were to engage with Gen AI for their business? You have some parameters in which you think people need to operate. Can you share a couple of those?
The single most important thing is to know your customers, know how to talk to your customers, know how they're getting value, and be able to communicate that back to them. And it's shocking how few companies ever have conversations with their customers about value.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think it just is something, I don't know, Western culture or in the US, you don't want to talk about pricing. Like everyone, I think that's the toughest thing when you're teaching sales is you just got to be transparent. It's not about you're trying to be the used car salesperson, is you've created value and you're trying to align it with what people care about. And if you get it right, then they should be willing to pay, right? Porsche versus
absolutely.
VW or something along those lines. But I think the thing for me that was so interesting was you could do this with as few as 50 customers, you said. You could have a
Yeah,
Gen I model produce the value analysis with as few as 50 customers. Is that right?
that's right. And I think it's 30 to 50.
30 to 50. And that gives you that's N. We always talk about N. And that's enough N for them to be for the models to be able to find the patterns so that then you can start to triangulate on the value that you're creating. Is that right?
And I think the key word there, Randy, is start to, because pricing is not done once and then set. Value pricing has to be adaptive. And in the SaaS world today, it has to be especially adaptive because stuff is changing. We're going through a tectonic change. The market is shifting under everyone's feet. You need an approach that's agile and adaptive. And that's another reason to move in this direction.
And
What you're doing,
continuous. And continuous,
continuous.
right?
Yeah,
I do think that is going back to that paradigm. You can grow by driving new logos, increasing gross retention or net retention, or a dedicated regular commitment to pricing. And this, powered by Gen AI, allows you to have a pricing council every month, allows you to come in and say what's happening in the market, and it can ingest what's happening with the competitors. And you can have almost not real time pricing, but you can have regular refreshed pricing that continues to tune the value that you are articulating and capturing. Is that basically the call to arms?
yes, only I would say it's more than once a month. It becomes, as you said, a continuous
Ah,
process. The way I think
well, that would
about
be
this,
interesting if your deal desk. Go ahead. Sorry.
what we need is a mashup of value based pricing and dynamic pricing that brings the best of the two together for this new generative AI world.